Chances are, if you know anything about Hanukkah, you have a fairly basic understanding of this as a revolt where some Greeks, or were they somehow Syrians or somehow hyphenated Syrian Greeks, invaded the land of Israel and somehow oppressed it, and then the Maccabees rose up against them, drove them out, and then rededicated the temple, which had been defiled. And there was this miracle with some oil, and it lasted for 8 days. And so, like all Jewish holidays, they tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. That's the basic understanding of the Maccabean revolt that we tend to get in, after school classes at Talmud Torah or on Sunday mornings and things like that. But when you actually get into the history of it, there's so much other fascinating material. First of all, we should understand that the Maccabean revolt was, at its root, essentially a civil war. It described a fissure between two large groups of Jews and how they felt they should relate to the world around them. This is a result of the political situation in which Israel had been under Greek dominance, that is, Hellenistic dominance, Greek cultural dominance, since Alexander conquered the region and then died suddenly in the year 322 before the Common Era. As I mentioned in the previous video, the Greeks were guests of the Jews long before they became an occupying power, but let's just try and understand the political circumstances first. So here, if you have a look at this map, you'll see that after Alexander died, his empire was divided amongst his successors. The two empires that are especially important for us are the Seleucid Empire, which is in the yellow and occupies much of Central Asia, and the Ptolemaic Empire, which is based in Egypt. Now, the reason why the Seleucid Empire is often called the Syrian Empire, it's because much of their activity was based in what would today be called Syria. But they were fundamentally Greek in orientation. The original leaders in particular were all of Greek descent, and they were all participating in larger Hellenistic culture. But when you look more closely at where Israel is located, right here, you'll see that on this map they have cleverly labeled it both yellow and purple because it was at the borderland between the Ptolemaic Empire based in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire based in Syria. And as a result, Israel was handed back and forth for much of the time, and only after the year 200 was it fairly firmly in the hands of the Syrian Greeks, and that's when most of the adventure of the Maccabean revolt occurs. The version of the story that you probably heard as a child had a very important role of this man, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was the leader of the Seleucid Empire between 175 and 164. He was definitely a very colorful figure. He definitely had a different approach to, shall we say, religious toleration than his predecessors had, and he was responsible for some terrible persecution of Jews in the middle of the 2nd century. He was also a bit of a madman. In fact, he had the nickname Epiphanes, means God made manifest, which is kind of like a typical name that you might want to take if you were an emperor of a large region like this, but he was known behind his back as Epimanes, which in Latin would be translated as Meshuggah. He used to do things like dress up as a commoner and then go to the bathhouses and, just try and slum it out with the regular people. And then he used to enjoy revealing himself as being, in fact, the emperor himself. And then he would ask, to have oil poured on him by everyone present. And he seems to have had a very troubled childhood, which I've talked about in a previous lecture. You can look at that if you want. At any rate, what is he specifically doing messing with Jewish religious practice? The reality is that most of these polytheistic empires were very tolerant of many different faiths because that's really part of what polytheism is all about. You have your God, I have my God, or you, more appropriately, you have your many gods, I have my many gods. Hey, let's trade them like, hockey cards or something like that. And that's the typical response of the Seleucids and the predecessor dynasties to Judaism in general, because it was just another one of these weird Middle Eastern faiths. What do we have to bother with it? But there was a brewing controversy within Israel itself. The thing is, Antiochus inherited an internal dispute among Jews, among those who were in favor of increasing their commitment to Hellenistic values and increasing their tolerance of polytheism, which is something that traditional Judaism looked down upon very strongly. And on the other hand, there were those who were more traditionalists who said, no, this is too much. You can't take us in this direction. It was a urban-rural divide, with Jerusalem in particular being dominated by Hellenizing elements, and the countryside tending to be favored by the traditionalists. Now, Antiochus, who was stinging from some military losses and had a significant tax burden that he had to raise from his population, began to become involved in this internal dispute because the highest office that Jews could hope to reach in Israel was the office of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And there were two major factions who were vying for it: the Hellenists, which were favored by a man named Jason, and another even more extreme figure named Menelaus on the one hand, and the traditionalists who favored someone named Chonia, also known as Onias. The Hellenists, first with Jason and then even more so under Menelaus, offered Antiochus more tax revenues, specifically suggesting that they would raid the temple treasury itself. And so Antiochus, who otherwise would never have gotten involved in such a suit, backed the Hellenizing party, first Jason and then later Menelaus. And after one humiliating military and political defeat, Antiochus chose to press his advantage with the Hellenizing elements by ransacking the temple himself, uh, dedicating it to Zeus rather than to the god of the Jews, and banning many traditional aspects of traditional Jewish practice, such as circumcision and the observance of the Sabbath. This sparked a revolt, but the roots of the revolt were really between the Jews themselves, between those Jews who wanted more accommodation to Hellenistic values on the one hand, and on the other hand, those who disagreed and said that the Greek world had to be held at an arm's length. The Maccabean Wars were absolutely fascinating, and there were a series of battles that were primarily led by Yehuda Maccabee, an incredible figure who was a brilliant military leader who understood that the asymmetrical nature of the conflict, with a large Syrian Greek army of as many as 70,000 troops, simply could not be engaged in a straightforward middle of the field kind of battle. And so he pioneered a lot of fascinating guerrilla tactics in order to defeat his enemy. But let's go to the beginnings of the war. As I mentioned earlier, there was a big urban-rural divide over how Hellenistic should the Jews be. And in a town called Modi'in, some enthusiasts of the Hellenistic way of life came and ordered, in accordance with the decrees of Antiochus, that the local population should sacrifice a pig to a Greek god. A family led by Matisyahu, with his several sons, demurred, and rather than sacrifice a pig to a Greek god, which would have been an act of idolatry, they chose to sacrifice the Jewish enthusiasts who had been promoting the act of idolatry. This sparked a genuine guerrilla war where the sons of Matisyahu and he fled to the hills, quite literally the Judean mountains, and from there they engaged in small attacks on the Syrian Greek forces, and more significantly on Jews who supported them. It's a tremendous amount of internal conflict here that made it a local conflict. The Syrian Greeks were not brought in big numbers until it was discovered that the local Jewish authorities simply could not handle them, and then increasingly large groups of real formal soldiers were brought in. Matisyahu himself passed away early on in the conflict, and his son Yehuda Maccabee proved to be an incredibly able general. He acquired a reputation for ferocity and brilliant strategic use of the terrain. At one particular battle early on, he seized the enemy commander's sword and he used it personally, symbolically, for the rest of the campaign. At another very important battle at Emmaus, he managed to defeat a group of regular forces who may have been as many as 4 times the size of his own ragtag band by force marching his own soldiers to attack the base when half of the enemy was out looking for Yehuda Maccabee. They set the base on fire so that when the group that was looking for Yehuda returned, they found that they were outnumbered after an exhausting search, and the entire contingent was destroyed. Remarkable strategy in battle. One of the most dramatic battles, however, was a battle that involved Greek use of war elephants, absolutely terrifying creatures. If you can imagine what it must have been like, that they would put some kind of fortified station on the top where more than a few soldiers could sit on top of the elephant and then attack from above. And so one of Yehuda's brothers, Elazar, thinking incorrectly as it happened, that Antiochus himself might be in one of those war elephants, Eleazar decided to attack the elephant from below and stab it, which he did successfully. However, the elephant in its death throes fell upon Eleazar and crushed him. This particular incident, by the way, was celebrated in Christian art. Let me just take you through some of them because they're just so fascinating. As you will note from this particular example, the Europeans who are describing this happens to be a 14th century German print, they don't know what an elephant actually looks like. So they sort of imagine some kind of a horse maybe, and oh, we've got some kind of a funny nose. Okay, fine. So a big horse, and the artist, obviously, in this example, could not believe exactly how Elazar would get underneath the horse, so he simply put him on top and striking it from above. So here is one that makes the horse look something like a, sort of a happy Doberman Pinscher of some size or something like that. Amazing. This one's great. I think it has kind of like a sort of a cat-like, tiger-like look. And this one is truly original, right? It's got sort of a salamander kind of effect going on. Here's the last one, I promise. We're back to the horse again, and it looks a little bit like a Dr. Seuss kind of representation. At this point, you might be wondering, what about the miracle? What exactly happened with the miracle? So this is the part that usually gets first billing, but in the historical sources, it actually gets remarkably little billing. So ultimately, after a series of reversals over several years, we're actually not speaking about 1, 2, or 3 battles. We're talking about a long, drawn-out conflict that took several years to resolve. Eventually, Yehuda was able to take back Jerusalem, take back the temple grounds, cleanse it of all of the Antiochus-inspired idolatry, and restore it back to its original function as a monotheistic site of worship of God. Let us recall that the very name Chanukah means dedication, in the sense of dedicating the temple. And one of the key elements is the menorah, which is shown here in the famous Arch of Titus. This is a piece of Roman monumental art that commemorates the defeat of Judea by the Romans in the 1st century, a little more than 200 years later. And as you can see here, they're carting away the spoils from the temple, including the menorah, the gold candelabrum. This is, by the way, more or less how it looks today. But Stephen Fine of Yeshiva University has done some chemical analysis of paint flecks and has been able to determine that it would have originally appeared to Romans like this in a painted version, which personally I actually like the way we have it today. It's much less garish and so on. But here you can see on the left there's a sign, the law of the Jews in Latin, which presumably would have been some kind of representation of the Torah. And then you can see labeled the candelabra of the Jews, of course the menorah, and on the right the holy thing of the Jews, which may have been the shulchan, the table, or perhaps part of the altar, something like that. At any rate, none of the earliest sources have a really clear description of the miracle, which seems to get such high billing. The earliest source that we have for the description of this miracle is a Baraita that occurs in the Talmudic tractate of Shabbat, page 21b to be precise. A Baraita or Baraisa is essentially a statement which is ancient in nature and is an oral tradition, it's handed down, but it was not included in the important collection of teachings that was brought together in the early 3rd century by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So it's difficult to date the Baraita very well, but that is essentially the place where we get the source of the story of the oil that continued to burn for 8 days when it should only have burned for 1. There are other elements in other early sources, such as the Megillat Ta'anit, which is a scroll of fast days that lists not really fast days per se. It mainly lists days in which fasting is not permitted. And other early sources do make reference to the need for a new menorah, for the need for some kind of way of kindling lights, presumably because of the defilement. But the 8-day story is actually not represented there. What is interesting on top of this, however, is that the Megillat Ta'anit and others note the date of this event is the 25th of Kislev. That's the first night of Hanukkah, is on the 25th of Kislev, which happens to be the exact date that Antiochus first defiled the temple. And so it is an anniversary of the defiling of the temple that marks the rededication, the Chanukah of the temple once again. So what I would like to say about all this is that the miracle of the oil is fascinating and there's a lot of interesting things written on it. But in my humble opinion, the most significant thing, at least from a historical perspective, is this incredible military victory that represents an assertion of Jewish independence from religious persecution, quite arguably the first such successful rebellion against religious persecution in recorded history. That's an amazing thing, and that's an amazing miracle. The story does not end with the dedication of the temple. Yehuda HaMaccabee's earliest supporters were called Hasidim, meaning pious ones. And these were the traditionalists who really wanted to get rid of all these Hellenizing elements and so on. And they followed him with tremendous zeal and with tremendous self-sacrifice. You know, the book of the Maccabees describes some amazing stories about the lengths that they would go to, like Eliezer, in order to defend their religious values. And Yehuda HaMaccabee's remarkable serial successes could only bolster their support for him and for the importance of his mission. However, he had so much early success that ultimately the Greeks had to sue for peace. They did not, however, simply leave the country. And in fact, the Maccabees would not have full independence, that is, including economic independence and the freedom from paying tribute, that is, taxes to the Syrians, for another 20 years. They wouldn't get that until long after Yehuda was gone in the year 142, and even then, only briefly. So we're not talking about a full political independence. What happens is the Syrian Greeks realize soon that fighting in this local conflict over whether or not the temple is Hellenistic in nature is really not in their interests. Antiochus has died. There are succession conflicts over who's going to take over after him. And so the general Lysias says, you know what? Let's have a do-over. I say we go back to status quo. Obviously, Antiochus had overstepped his boundaries and had banned your traditional practices like circumcision and observing of Shabbat. And I know he messed up your temple. You really didn't like that. So how about we just go back to the way it was before 167, before all this happened? And Yehuda said, no way. Yehuda HaMaccabee, who was, zealous for the cause of Jewish nationalism and Jewish religious freedom to the utmost, he said, no way. Tolerance is not enough. We want you gone. However, he lost the backing of his most ardent supporters who said, status quo ante, that actually sounds pretty good. In other words, the Hasidim felt that it wasn't really worth it to keep fighting the Syrian Greeks when what they really wanted was religious freedom. As long as they were free to do what they wanted with Shabbat and with circumcision and with the temple ritual, okay, so we have to pay taxes to somebody. We'll pay it to the Greeks. What's the big deal? And so Yehuda actually lost some of his main supporters because the majority of the people, although they were incensed at the idea of an infringement on their religious values, once those religious values were left alone and they went back to status quo ante, they were prepared to abandon Yehuda. And there's much more to say about the political fallout of that decision, but ultimately that's what happened. Lysias put in another Kohen Gadol named Alcimos, who was actually much more amenable to the Hasidim than Menelaus, who was ultimately executed, and they were prepared to manage with the Greeks at arm's length, which was in many ways the end of the Maccabean revolt, even though Yehuda would press the issue further and there would be ongoing conflict afterwards. Because we have this deep idea in the Jewish tradition that ein mikra ba'olam, there is no such thing as coincidence in the world, that all of these things are somehow connected. It's made explicit by the great thinker Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, for example. If you'll note in the liturgy, which definitely is quite ancient regarding Hanukkah, when it says, Bayamim hahem, bazman hazeh, in those days, but in this time, in other words, in our time. And Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler and others point out that in Jewish philosophy, time is like a gyre, like a spiral, like some kind of coil, and that we go around in circles, and maybe it's an expanding gyre, but we go around in circles and we eventually come back to the same point that we were at a long time ago, and on a calendrical rhythm as well. So it's not at all ironic that the holiday of Hanukkah, which is so much associated with defending religious individualism, is assailed every year by an overwhelming tide of assimilationism. And that the struggle of Yehuda Maccabi and the Hasidim to defend Jewish particularism and the Jewish way of thought, Jewish way of practice, Jewish way of life, against an overwhelming global tidal wave of sameness, of fit in, of be like everyone else. That's the same struggle that we have today. And so with that thought, I want to wish you a Lichtig and Chanukah. I hope you found this lecture useful. Thanks very much for watching.